The morning sun peeked through the airport windows as passengers shuffled through security for Flight 823 to London. Among them was Lynn, a woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes and a worn leather messenger bag clutched tightly against her chest. She kept checking her watch, her gaze darting between the departure board and the growing line at the gate. Last call for Flight 823 to London Heathrow. The announcement echoed through the terminal. Lynn rushed forward, handing her boarding pass to the gate agent who barely looked up as she scanned it. "Cutting it close," the agent muttered, returning the pass with a practiced smile. As Lynn stepped onto the plane, flight attendant Thomas greeted passengers with the same cheerful, "Welcome aboard" he'd repeated 60 times already. But something about this passenger made him pause. She seemed off. Not dangerous, just unsettled. Her knuckles were white from gripping her bag, and she avoided eye contact. "Seat 14C is midway down on your right," Tomas said, his voice softening. Lynn nodded without looking up and moved quickly down the aisle. The Boeing 777 was nearly full, the overhead bins crammed with carry-ons. Lynn found her seat between a heavy-set businessman already spilling into her space and a teenager with headphones. She tucked her bag under the seat in front of her instead of using the overhead bin, earning an approving nod from a passing flight attendant named Priya. "Smart choice," Priya said. "Those bins are ready to burst." Lynn managed a tight smile but said nothing. As the safety demonstration played, Thomas noticed that while most passengers ignored it in favor of phones or magazines, Lynn watched with unusual intensity, mouthing the instructions to herself. When the plane began taxiing, she closed her eyes and gripped the armrests. Her breathing deliberately measured. 3 hours into the transatlantic flight, most passengers had settled into the mind-numbing routine of long-haul travel. Movies played on seatback screens. The smell of reheated pasta drifted through the cabin. Thomas and the other attendants had served drinks, collected trash, and were enjoying a brief lull in a flight that had, so far, been blissfully uneventful. That's when he noticed Lynn's behavior changing. First came the bathroom trips, 4 in the past hour. Each time she returned to her seat more agitated than before. Then the muttering started, not loud enough for other passengers to hear over the engine noise, but Thomas caught fragments as he passed with the beverage cart. "Have to tell them, before we land. Might be too late." Between bathroom visits, she pulled out a notebook and scribbled frantically. Thomas glimpsed what looked like calculations, arrows connecting phrases in what might have been different languages. When she noticed him looking, she hunched over the notebook protectively. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked, pausing at her row. Lynn looked up, startled. For a moment their eyes met, and Thomas saw something that sent a chill through him. Not madness or malice, but a burning urgency. "Fine," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Just a bit of motion sickness." Thomas nodded and moved on, but mentioned it to Priya during their next galley check-in. "The woman in 14C seems off," he said quietly. "Nothing specific, just watch her if you pass by," Priya frowned. "The one who keeps going to the bathroom? I noticed that too." An hour later, as the plane cruised at 38,000 feet somewhere over the Atlantic, the incident that would change everyone's flight occurred. Lynn had been growing increasingly restless, checking her watch every few minutes and scanning the cabin as if looking for something. The businessman beside her had fallen asleep, his head lolling dangerously close to her shoulder. The teenager had switched from music to a movie, oblivious to everything. Lynn suddenly stood up, stumbling slightly as the plane hit a patch of turbulence. She grabbed the headrest in front of her to steady herself, drawing irritated glances from nearby passengers. Instead of heading toward the bathroom again, she moved across the aisle to where a woman about her own age was reading. Without warning, Lynn leaned down and gripped the woman's arm. The woman looked up, startled, as Lynn whispered something urgently into her ear. The woman's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Get away from me," she said loudly enough for several rows to hear. Lynn kept whispering, her grip tightening on the woman's arm. The woman raised her hand, signaling frantically for a flight attendant. Tomas was at the back of the plane when Priya's voice came over the intercom asking for assistance in the mid-cabin. The carefully neutral tone told him this wasn't a spilled drink situation. He hurried forward, passing through business class where passengers were craning their necks to see what was happening. By the time he reached row 14, Lynn was still bent over the frightened passenger, whispering intensely. Two other passengers had stood up, one of them a tall man who looked ready to intervene. "Ma'am," Tomas said firmly, placing himself between Lynn and the seated passenger. "I need you to return to your seat right now." Lynn straightened, her eyes wild but focused. "You don't understand," she said, her voice low but clear. "I have to—" Before she could finish, two men appeared from different parts of the cabin, moving with purposeful calm that instantly marked them as air marshals. One positioned himself beside Lynn while the other spoke quietly to Thomas. "We've been observing," the marshal said. "We'll take it from here." Everything happened quickly after that. The marshals identified themselves to Lynn, who surprisingly didn't resist as they escorted her to the rear galley. Thomas followed, his heart pounding. In his 12 years as a flight attendant, he'd dealt with drunk passengers, medical emergencies, and terrified first-time flyers, but this felt different. In the galley, the lead flight attendant, a veteran named Kai, who'd been flying since Thomas was in grade school, was already on the phone with the captain. The marshals had Lynn seated in the jump seat, her hands secured with plastic restraints. She wasn't struggling or shouting. In fact, her sudden calm was almost more unsettling than her previous agitation. "Has she said what this is about?" Kai asked the marshals, hand covering the phone's mouthpiece. The taller marshal shook his head. "Not yet. She's requested to speak directly to the captain, says it's urgent." Kai rolled his eyes. "They always think it's urgent." He spoke into the phone again, then looked at Thomas. "Get her bag. We need to check it." Thomas returned to 14C, where passengers were buzzing with theories about what had happened. The businessman who'd been sleeping next to Lynn was now wide awake, telling anyone who would listen that he'd known something was off about her from the start. The teenager had removed their headphones and was texting rapidly, no doubt sharing the drama with friends despite the airplane mode requirements. Lynn's messenger bag was still under the seat. Thomas took it, noting how unexpectedly heavy it was. Back in the galley, he handed it to Kai, who emptied the contents onto the counter while a marshal watched closely. Inside were dozens of pieces of paper covered in handwriting, some torn from notebooks, others on hotel stationery, a few on what looked like medical forms. Many had drawings that resembled molecular structures. There were 3 passports, all appearing to belong to Lynn but issued by different countries. A small laptop, a case containing several prescription bottles with labels in what looked like Japanese or Chinese characters. And strangest of all, a sealed plastic bag containing what appeared to be medical masks and small vials. The marshals exchanged glances. One picked up the bag with the vials while the other flipped through the passports. "Captain needs to see this," the first marshal said. "And we should notify ground authorities immediately." As Thomas watched this unfold, he found himself unexpectedly troubled. In training, they were taught to look for certain signs of trouble: aggressiveness, intoxication, erratic behavior. Lynn showed some of these, yes, but there was something about her eyes. Not the wildness of someone dangerous, but the focused intensity of someone desperate to be heard. Priya appeared at his elbow. "The natives are getting restless out there," she murmured. "Everyone wants to know what's happening." Kai ended his call with the captain and turned to the crew. "Here's the situation. We're treating this as a security incident until proven otherwise. The captain is notifying authorities at Heathrow, and we're going to continue as normal. Tell the passengers there was a medical issue that's under control." As the other crew members nodded and dispersed to their stations, Thomas found himself looking back at Lynn. She sat perfectly still on the jump seat, eyes closed, almost meditative despite the restraints around her wrists. She opened her eyes suddenly, as if sensing his gaze, and the look she gave him wasn't one of anger or fear. It was relief, as if being detained was somehow exactly what she had wanted, and that more than anything else that had happened sent a chill down Thomas's spine. The rear galley of the aircraft had become an impromptu interrogation room. Lynn sat quietly on the jump seat, her wrists bound with plastic restraints while the air marshals methodically sorted through the contents of her messenger bag. The lead flight attendant, Kai, stood with his arms crossed, occasionally glancing at his watch. They were still 4 hours from London, and the situation had put the entire crew on edge. "Can I get some water?" Lynn asked, her voice surprisingly steady. The shorter marshal looked to Kai, who nodded. Thomas filled a plastic cup and handed it to Lynn, who had to awkwardly maneuver with her restrained hands. "Thank you," she said, making deliberate eye contact with Thomas. There was something unsettling about her calmness now, compared to her earlier frantic behavior. The taller marshal held up one of the 3 passports. These all have different names but similar photos. Care to explain which one is real? Lynn took a slow sip of water. They're all real. And all mine, Kai snorted. That's not how passports work. It is when you work for certain organizations, Lynn replied cryptically. The marshals exchanged glances. The taller one stepped away to make a call on the crew phone, speaking in hushed tones to someone on the ground. Thomas couldn't help but notice the contents of Lynn's bag spread across the counter. The papers were covered in what looked like scientific notations, formulas, diagrams of molecular structures, and handwritten notes in at least 3 different languages. Some pages had flight numbers circled, including their own. What are these? He asked, pointing to the sealed bag containing vials and masks. Lynn's eyes flickered to the bag. Testing equipment. Testing for what? Kai demanded. Before she could answer, Priya appeared at the galley entrance. We need help in the cabin, she said to Tomas. People are getting anxious, asking questions. Kai nodded for Tomas to go. Keep it vague, he instructed. Medical issue, everything's under control. As Thomas returned to the main cabin, he could feel dozens of eyes tracking his movement. The atmosphere had changed. That unique tension that spreads through confined spaces when something unusual happens. A middle-aged man stopped him in the aisle. Is it a terrorist? He asked bluntly, loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear. Thomas gave his most reassuring smile. No, sir. Just a passenger experiencing some distress. Everything's under control. She didn't look distressed to me, piped up a woman across the aisle. She looked like she knew exactly what she was doing. Others joined in with their observations and theories, each more dramatic than the last. Thomas moved through the cabin, repeating the same calming phrases, aware that his words were doing little to quell the ripple of unease. When he reached row 14, the businessman who had been sitting next to Lynn was holding court. Kept fidgeting the whole time he was telling the surrounding passengers, writing in that notebook like her life depended on it. I tried to start a conversation during takeoff, but she just stared right through me. The teenager who had been on Lynn's other side nodded enthusiastically. I saw her watching people. Like really watching them. Every time someone coughed or sneezed, she'd write something down. This detail caught Tomas's attention. He paused, considering asking the teen more questions, but Priya appeared at his side. Captain wants an update, she murmured. And there's something else. 2 passengers in business class have been asking for medication. Both have fever and cough. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cabin temperature. Probably just coincidence, he said, not entirely believing it himself. Back in the galley, the scene had changed. The captain himself had emerged from the cockpit, a rarity during flight unless something was seriously wrong. He was a veteran pilot in his late 50s named Wei, known for his calm demeanor even in turbulence. Right now he didn't look calm. Our passenger wants to speak directly to you, Captain, the taller marshal explained. Refuses to talk otherwise. Wei studied Lynn with narrowed eyes. We're diverting to Shannon Airport in Ireland, he informed her. Authorities will be waiting. Lynn shook her head. That would be a mistake. We need to continue to London. Heathrow has the facilities we'll need. We'll need? Wei raised an eyebrow. Captain, Lynn said, leaning forward despite her restraints. I need you to listen carefully. I'm not a threat to this aircraft. I'm trying to prevent a much bigger threat. The plastic restraints creaked as she shifted. I'm Dr. Lin Zhao. I work with the Global Health Monitoring Initiative. 3 days ago, I attended a medical conference in Beijing, where several delegates fell ill with unusual symptoms. Yesterday, I received confirmation that they tested positive for a new respiratory pathogen. She nodded toward the papers spread on the counter. Those are my notes tracking potential carriers on international flights leaving the conference. This flight has at least 3 passengers who attended that conference, and based on my observations, they're already showing early symptoms. The galley fell silent. Thomas felt his heartbeat quicken as he recalled what Priya had just told him about the sick passengers in business class. Wei's expression remained skeptical. If what you're saying is true, why the secrecy? Why not identify yourself to the crew immediately? Lynn's face hardened. Because I'm not supposed to be on this flight. I'm not supposed to be tracking these individuals. There are political complications. International health protocols are being blocked by certain interests. People who don't want panic before a major trade agreement is signed. She gestured to the vials in the sealed bag. Those contain rapid tests I developed. If you'll remove my restraints, I can confirm whether we're dealing with this pathogen. The marshals looked to the captain, who seemed torn between skepticism and concern. These passengers you claim are infected. Where are they seated? 4A, 17F, and 28B, Lynn replied without hesitation. Thomas and Priya exchanged glances. The passengers who asked for medication are in business class. That would include 4A, Priya confirmed quietly. Wei's face darkened. He turned to Kai. Discreetly check on 17F and 28B. Don't alarm them. Just observe and report back. As Kai slipped away, Wei pulled the marshals and remaining flight attendants into a tight circle. Out of Lynn's earshot, "We need to verify her identity," he said in a low voice. "Get ground control to contact this global health whatever and confirm she is who she says." "What if she's right?" Thomas asked, thinking of the sick passengers and Lynn's detailed notes. Wei rubbed his temples. "Then we have a potential medical emergency on our hands. But we follow protocol. No panic, no assumptions until we have confirmation." The shorter marshal spoke up. "I can contact Interpol to run her credentials, but it will take time." Time we might not have, Tomas found himself saying, surprising everyone including himself. If there really are sick passengers who could infect others, Wei gave him a sharp look. "We don't know that yet." Just then Kai returned to the galley, his normally composed face visibly concerned. 17F is asleep but visibly sweating. 28B asked for water and pain relievers about 20 minutes ago. Said he had a headache and sore throat. The information landed heavily in the cramped space. We looked back at Lynn, who sat watching them with that same unnerving calm. "I need to get back to the cockpit and update ground control," Wei decided. "Keep her secured, but treat her statement as credible until proven otherwise, and get more information about this supposed pathogen." After the captain left, the air in the galley felt thicker somehow. Thomas found himself looking at the other crew members, wondering if they shared his growing unease. The marshals resumed their examination of Lynn's documents, this time with greater interest than suspicion. Priya moved to the medicine kit, taking inventory. "If this turns out to be real, we should prepare," she said quietly. "How many masks do we have on board?" "Standard supply," Kai replied. "Enough for the crew, not for all passengers." Lynn spoke up, her voice carrying clearly. "In my bag, there's a document titled Aircraft Infection Control Measures. It outlines how to create barriers using materials available on a standard aircraft." The taller marshal located the document and scanned it. Without a word, he handed it to Kai, whose skepticism visibly faltered as he read. "This is remarkably detailed," he admitted. "I've done this before," Lynn said simply. Thomas moved closer to Lynn, keeping his voice low. "Those people you approached before we detained you, what were you trying to tell them?" Lynn met his gaze steadily. "I was warning them to move away from passenger 17F. I saw him coughing without covering his mouth. By my calculation, anyone within 2 rows could be exposed." A chill ran through Tomas. "And the woman you grabbed? She was in that zone?" Lynn nodded. "I frightened her. I realize that now. But I couldn't think of another way to protect her without causing a general panic. Something in her expression, a mixture of professional determination and human worry, made Thomas reconsider everything that had happened. What had seemed like the erratic behavior of a troubled passenger now looked like the desperate actions of someone trying to prevent disaster without authority to do so. Before he could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom, addressing the entire aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Wei speaking. We're experiencing some technical difficulties that require special attention upon landing. As a precautionary measure, we will be implementing some additional procedures during the remainder of our flight. Please follow all crew instructions carefully. There is no cause for alarm." The announcement, meant to be reassuring, had the opposite effect. Through the galley curtain, Tomas could hear the immediate rise in passenger voices, questions, concerns, theories spreading through the cabin like wildfire. Kai's phone rang. He answered, listened briefly, then looked at the team gathered in the galley. That was the cockpit. "Ground control confirmed there's a Dr. Lin Zhao registered with the Global Health Monitoring Initiative." He turned to Lin. "They're patching through a secure line so you can speak directly with your organization." For the first time since her detention, Lynn's composed facade cracked slightly. Relief flooded her features, making her suddenly look exhausted. "Thank you," she said quietly. The marshals exchanged looks. Then the taller one stepped forward and removed Lynn's restraints. As she rubbed her wrists, Lynn looked up at the crew surrounding her. "We have work to do," she said simply, "and not much time." Thomas felt a strange mixture of dread and purpose settle over him. Whatever came next would be unlike anything in his 12 years of flying. As he caught Priya's eye across the galley, he knew she felt it too. Their training had prepared them for emergencies, medical issues, turbulence, even threats. But nothing had prepared them for this, a potential outbreak at 38,000 feet, with nowhere to go and hours still to fly. The atmosphere in the aircraft had shifted dramatically. What began as a typical transatlantic flight was now operating under the shadow of a potential health crisis. In the rear galley, Dr. Lin Zhao spoke rapidly into the crew phone, her free hand sketching diagrams on a napkin as she consulted with her colleagues at the Global Health Monitoring Initiative. "Yes, 3 confirmed showing symptoms," she was saying. "Temperature, dry cough, fatigue. Onset appears to be accelerating compared to the Beijing cases." She listened for a moment, then shook her head. "No, I don't think we can wait that long." Tomas watched her, still processing the transformation from suspicious passenger to commanding medical professional. Around him, the crew had mobilized with surprising efficiency. Kai was inventorying supplies, while Priya and 2 other flight attendants were preparing the items Lynn had requested. Bottles of hand sanitizer, gloves from the first aid kits, and every mask they could find on board. The air marshals had shifted roles as well, now helping to create a makeshift isolation area in the last 3 rows of economy class. They'd asked passengers to relocate, explaining it as a precautionary measure for passengers requiring medical attention. Captain Wei emerged from the cockpit again, his face tense. "Heathrow confirms they'll have a medical team standing by, but they're asking for more details about what we're dealing with." Lynn ended her call and turned to the captain. "It's a novel respiratory pathogen that appears to be a variant of an existing virus. Highly contagious, with an incubation period of approximately 36 hours before symptoms appear. After that, transmission rates increase exponentially." She pointed to her notes. "The good news is that it responds to existing antivirals if caught early. The bad news is that in the confined space of an aircraft with recirculated air," her voice trailed off. "How bad could it get?" Thomas asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. Lynn met his gaze directly. "Without intervention, a significant percentage of passengers could be infected by landing, and each would become a vector, potentially spreading it further before showing symptoms." A heavy silence settled over the galley. The enormity of what they were facing sank in. Not just a problem for this flight, but potentially something that could spread across countries, continents. "What do we do?" Priya asked, her usual confidence wavering slightly. Lynn straightened her shoulders. "We implement containment protocols. Move the symptomatic passengers to the isolation area. Distribute masks, prioritizing those seated near the affected individuals. Minimize movement throughout the cabin. And I need to test the 3 passengers to confirm we're dealing with what I think we are." "And if we are," Captain Wei asked quietly, "then London health authorities will need to track and test everyone on this flight after we land. But right now, our job is to prevent as many new infections as possible during the next 3 hours." Wei nodded. "The decision made. Tell us what you need." Lynn quickly organized them into teams. Kai and the taller marshal would approach the passenger in 4A, a businessman who had already reported feeling unwell. Priya and the other marshal would handle 28B, while Thomas would assist Lynn with the passenger in 17F, who had been observed coughing. "Explain that we're implementing precautionary health measures," Lynn instructed. "Be calm, be reassuring, but be firm. We need them to move to the isolation area for their comfort and the well-being of others." She handed each team a small kit containing gloves, masks, and one of the testing devices from her bag. "The test is simple. It's a cheek swab that detects viral proteins. Results take about 10 minutes. As they prepared to separate, Lynn added one more thing. "These people aren't just patients. They're scared humans in a confusing situation. Treat them with dignity." Thomas followed Lynn into the main cabin, feeling the weight of dozens of curious eyes. Passengers had picked up on the unusual activity, the whispering, the crew members donning masks. Fear was a contagion of its own kind, spreading through raised eyebrows and worried glances. They reached row 17, where a man in his early 60s was slumped against the window, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. The middle seat beside him was empty. The passenger had relocated when the coughing started. Lynn knelt beside the row. "Sir," she said gently. "My name is Dr. Zhao. How are you feeling?" The man stirred, blinking slowly. "Not great," he admitted, his voice raspy. "Thought it was just jet lag, but—" He gestured vaguely to himself. "I understand. I'm going to ask you some questions if that's okay." Lynn's voice had transformed, gentle but authoritative, the kind that inspired trust. Thomas watched as she asked about the man's symptoms, when they began, whether he'd attended a conference in Beijing. The passenger, whose name was Chen, they learned, confirmed everything, growing more concerned with each answer. Is this serious?" Chen asked, a flicker of fear crossing his feverish face. Lynn placed a reassuring hand on his arm despite the potential risk to herself. "We're taking precautions. I'd like to move you to a more comfortable area where you can lie down, and I'd like to do a quick test to determine the best way to help you." To Thomas's surprise, Chen agreed without resistance. Together, they helped him to the isolation area at the rear of the plane, where makeshift beds had been created by lowering tray tables and using airline blankets and pillows to create as much comfort as possible. The other teams had also succeeded. The businessman from 4A was already there, looking miserable but cooperative. As Tomas and Lynn settled Chen, the third passenger arrived, supported by Priya and the marshal. Lynn worked quickly, taking samples from each passenger and explaining the testing process. Thomas assisted, handing her supplies and helping to make the passengers as comfortable as possible. Despite the circumstances, there was something remarkable about watching Lynn work. Her movements efficient, her manner somehow both clinical and deeply human. When the samples were collected, Lynn stepped back to the galley to process them. Thomas stayed with the passengers, offering water and reassurance. "Never thought my business trip would end like this," the man from 4A commented with a weak attempt at humor. "We're taking good care of you," Thomas assured him. "Dr. Zhao is one of the best at what she does." He surprised himself with this statement. Hours ago, he'd seen Lynn as a potential threat, and now he was vouching for her expertise. In the galley, the tension was palpable as Lynn studied the testing devices. Kai, Priya, and Captain Wei waited in silence, the future of the flight hanging in the balance. Finally, Lynn looked up. Her expression confirmed what they feared before she spoke. "All three positive," she said quietly. "It's the same variant we saw in Beijing." Captain Wei's shoulders dropped slightly, the only outward sign of his concern. "What's our next move?" Lynn didn't hesitate. "We implement full containment protocol. Every passenger needs a mask. We need to create clean zones and potentially exposed zones based on seating. And we notify London that we're bringing in confirmed cases." As the crew dispersed to implement these measures, Thomas found himself working alongside Lynn to prepare masks for distribution. They had enough for maybe 2/3 of the passengers, which meant prioritizing those in highest risk areas. "Why did you do it this way?" Thomas asked as they worked. "Why not identify yourself to the crew from the beginning?" Lynn's hands paused briefly. "I tried at check-in. Was told to file a report with airline customer service." A hint of frustration crossed her face. "Then I tried again during boarding, but no one took you seriously," Thomas finished for her. She nodded. "I've seen this before. By the time bureaucracy catches up to a pathogen, it's already spread. Sometimes you have to create a situation that can't be ignored, even if it means being detained and restrained," Thomas asked, remembering how calm she'd been even when treated as a threat. Even then, her eyes met his and he saw the weight of previous experiences there. Sometimes being heard is worth the risk. Their conversation was interrupted by Priya, who rushed into the galley. "We have a problem. 2 more passengers are reporting symptoms now, 10D and 32F, and people are starting to panic as we're handing out masks." Lynn immediately switched back to crisis mode. "We need to address the entire cabin. Calm them, inform them, give them clear instructions." "I'll get the captain to make an announcement," Kai said, reaching for the intercom. Lynn shook her head. "No. People need to see a face, not just hear a voice. They need to know this is being handled by actual humans who care about their safety." Captain Wei considered this, then nodded. "You're right. But what do we tell them? The truth could cause panic. A version of the truth, Lynn replied. Enough so they understand the importance of following instructions without causing unnecessary fear. The captain looked to his crew. Opinions? Thomas found himself speaking up. I think Dr. Zhao is right. Passengers know something's happening. Rumors are probably worse than facts at this point. After a moment's consideration, Wei agreed. They quickly formulated a plan. The captain would introduce Lynn as a medical specialist, and she would explain the situation and necessary precautions. Minutes later, Thomas stood in the aisle, watching as Lynn addressed the cabin. She'd removed her rumpled blazer and stood confidently in a simple white blouse, her medical credentials now clearly displayed around her neck. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice clear and steady. I'm Dr. Lin Zhao with the Global Health Monitoring Initiative. We've identified several passengers on this flight who are experiencing symptoms consistent with a respiratory illness. While we complete testing, we're implementing precautionary measures to ensure everyone's safety. She explained the mask distribution, the importance of staying seated, and the isolation area. Remarkably, instead of increasing panic, her calm professionalism seemed to reassure many passengers. There were questions, many questions, but the feared chaos didn't materialize. As Lynn finished speaking, an elderly woman near the front raised her hand. Are we in danger, doctor? She asked, her voice quavering slightly. The cabin fell silent, everyone waiting for the answer. Lynn took a moment before responding, and Thomas recognized she was choosing her words carefully. We're taking every possible measure to minimize risk. By working together and following these precautions, we greatly reduce the chance of further transmission. She looked around the cabin, making eye contact with worried faces. I understand this is frightening, but I've dealt with similar situations before, and what makes the difference is how we respond as a community. Right now, we are a community of 218 people who need to take care of each other for the next few hours. Something in her words, the honesty, the call to collective action, seemed to resonate. Thomas watched as passengers who had been on the verge of panic began to nod, to straighten their shoulders, to accept the masks being distributed. As Lynn returned to the rear of the plane, passengers applauded spontaneously. The sound rippled through the cabin, not enthusiastic or celebratory, but something more profound, an acknowledgement of shared humanity in a crisis. Tomas caught Lynn's eye as she passed him in the aisle. That was impressive, he said quietly. Lynn gave a small, tired smile. People are often at their best when faced with the truth and given a way to help. Then her expression grew serious again. But we're not out of the woods yet, not even close. The plane had become a floating hospital ward. 2.5 hours from London, the cabin was divided into zones, green for passengers with no known exposure, yellow for those who had been seated near the infected, and red for the isolation area at the back. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with purpose, their faces now masked, distributing water and answering questions with practiced calm. In the rear galley, Dr. Lin Zhao had established a makeshift command center. Diagrams of the cabin. Seating were taped to cabinet doors with colored markers indicating confirmed cases, suspected exposures, and clean zones. The latest update wasn't good. 2 more passengers had developed symptoms, bringing the total to 7. The rate of onset is accelerating, Lynn said, marking the new cases on her diagram. That matches what we saw in Beijing. Captain Wei, who had emerged from the cockpit to check on the situation, frowned. What does that mean for us? It means time is working against us, Lynn replied, checking her watch. Each new case creates more potential exposures. If we were on the ground, we'd isolate each case immediately in proper facilities. Thomas, who had just finished distributing masks to the last section, joined the conversation. But we're not on the ground. We're stuck in a metal tube with recirculated air for another 2.5 hours. Lynn nodded grimly. Exactly, which is why we need to get creative. She unfolded a technical diagram of the Boeing 777 that the captain had provided. The air circulation system on this aircraft pulls air from the ceiling and pushes it out through floor vents. It's designed to limit airflow between cabin sections. Her finger traced the patterns. We can use that to our advantage. For the next 20 minutes, the team huddled around the diagram as Lynn explained her plan. They would reconfigure the seating to create more definitive boundaries between zones, limiting cross-contamination. The air marshals, now fully integrated into the response team, would help manage passenger relocation. Meal service would be suspended entirely to reduce movement and contact. Most crucially, they would improvise additional barriers using plastic sheeting from the catering supplies, secured with medical tape from the first aid kits. It wasn't perfect, but it might help contain the airborne particles. It's going to be challenging, Lynn admitted. People are already anxious, and now we're going to ask some to move again. Priya, who had proven remarkably adaptable throughout the crisis, offered a solution. What if we frame it as an upgrade? Anyone in the yellow zones gets moved to empty seats in business or first class where possible. Makes it feel like they're getting something, not just being shuffled around. Kai nodded approvingly. Good thinking. We have 8 empty seats in business we can use. As the team dispersed to implement the plan, Thomas found himself working alongside Lynn again, preparing the plastic barriers. Her movements were precise but showed signs of fatigue, hands slightly trembling, dark circles forming under her eyes. When was the last time you slept? Thomas asked, cutting lengths of tape. Lynn gave a small laugh. Properly. Before the conference, maybe. 4 days ago? You should rest, even just for 20 minutes. She shook her head. No time. The infected passengers need monitoring, and we need you functioning. Thomas interrupted gently. You're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion. Lynn paused, seemingly surprised by his directness. For a moment, the professional mask slipped and Thomas caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath. A woman who had been carrying an impossible burden alone. I'll rest when we land, she said finally, but her tone had softened. But thank you for the concern. As they worked, Thomas found himself curious about the woman who hours ago had been their detained passenger. How did you get into this line of work, chasing diseases around the world? Lynn's hands continued moving, but her expression turned reflective. I was in medical school during the last major outbreak in Asia. My hometown was hit hard. She paused. My parents were doctors too. They didn't survive. I'm sorry, Thomas said quietly. After that, it seemed like the only path that made sense. She secured a corner of plastic sheeting to an overhead bin. What about you? How does someone become a flight attendant? Thomas smiled behind his mask. Less dramatic than your story. I wanted to see the world, and I was tired of working in my family's restaurant. 12 years later, here I am. Any regrets? Even on days like today? He considered the question seriously. Strangely, no. Not even today. Especially not today, actually. This is the first time I've felt like what I'm doing up here really matters. Lynn stopped working and looked at him directly. It always matters, Thomas, every flight. The safety you provide, the comfort, the human connection. Don't underestimate that. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted from the isolation area. A male voice was shouting, followed by the sound of coughing. Lynn and Thomas rushed over to find Chen, the passenger from 17F, trying to push past one of the air marshals. I need to use the bathroom, Chen was insisting, his face flushed with fever. You can't keep me prisoner here. The marshal was trying to explain about the dedicated lavatory in the isolation zone, but Chen was becoming increasingly agitated, his breathing labored and panicky. Lynn stepped forward. Mr. Chen, she said, her voice calm but authoritative. I need you to take a deep breath for me. You're experiencing anxiety, which is completely understandable, but it's making your breathing more difficult. Chen's wild eyes fixed on her. You don't understand. I need to call my daughter. She's waiting for me in London. She's only 16, she's alone at the hotel. Understanding dawned on Lynn's face. You're worried about your daughter. Of course you are. She gestured for Thomas to bring the crew phone. Let's call the hotel right now. We can leave a message for her, let her know what's happening. The simple acknowledgement of his fear and the practical solution seemed to deflate Chen's panic. He sank back onto his makeshift bed, nodding gratefully as Lin helped him dial the hotel. As Chen spoke to the hotel's front desk, leaving detailed instructions for his daughter, Thomas watched Lin's interaction with the other patients. She checked temperatures, adjusted oxygen levels for one who was struggling more than others, and spoke quietly with each person. Despite her exhaustion, she gave them her complete attention, treating them not as disease vectors but as people caught in a frightening situation. When she finished her rounds, Lin returned to Thomas. "We need to talk about landing preparations," she said, leading him back to the galley. "London is sending a specialized team to meet the aircraft, but the transfer from plane to medical facilities will be the highest risk period." She pulled out a fresh diagram. "We'll need to disembark in order of risk categories, green zone first, then yellow, then red. The medical team will board to assist with the confirmed cases." Captain Wei joined them, bringing updates from his latest communication with Heathrow. "They're clearing a remote gate for us. No other aircraft within 100 meters. Medical personnel are being briefed now." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. The improvised barriers were installed, creating visible separations between cabin sections. Passengers were relocated according to exposure risk, with those moved to business class displaying a mix of relief and concern about why they specifically had been chosen. Priya had developed a system for handling passenger questions, creating small information cards that addressed common concerns without requiring repeated face-to-face conversations. Kai coordinated with the rest of the crew, ensuring everyone understood the landing and disembarkation procedures. The atmosphere among the passengers had evolved from the initial fear to something more complex, a shared experience of uncertainty, but also of community. Small acts of kindness appeared. A businessman offering his phone charger to an anxious mother, an elderly couple sharing snacks with the family across the aisle, passengers helping each other adjust masks properly. "It's remarkable," Priya commented during a brief break in the galley. "A few hours ago, these were just strangers annoyed about sitting next to each other. Now they're looking out for one another." Lin, who was updating her notes, looked up. "Crisis brings out who people really are. Sometimes it's the worst, but often it's the best." An hour from landing, the pilot's voice came over the intercom again, explaining the special disembarkation procedures. He ended with words of gratitude. "I want to thank everyone for their cooperation during this unusual situation. Your calm and understanding have made an incredibly challenging flight manageable. Our crew has been exemplary, and we've been fortunate to have Dr. Zhao on board. We'll be on the ground soon, and medical professionals are standing by." As the announcement ended, applause rippled through the cabin again, stronger this time. A release of tension and an acknowledgement of shared experience. In the galley, the crew gathered for a final briefing. Captain Wei addressed them with uncharacteristic emotion. "Whatever happens when we land, I want you all to know that your performance today has been nothing short of extraordinary. You've faced a situation none of us was trained for, and you've met it with professionalism and humanity." He turned to Lin. "And to you, Doctor, I owe a personal apology. If we had listened sooner." Lin shook her head. "You did what you were supposed to do with a passenger behaving suspiciously. And when the facts became clear, you adapted immediately. That's all anyone can ask." The captain nodded gratefully, then turned to final preparations. As the team dispersed, Thomas found himself alone with Lin again, helping her pack her medical supplies. "What happens to you when we land?" he asked. "Will you be quarantined with the passengers?" Lin secured her bag. "I'll need to be tested, but my priority will be working with the London team to ensure proper contact tracing. Every passenger will need to be monitored for the next week minimum. And after that, back to chasing the next outbreak?" Something in his tone made her pause and really look at him. "That's the job," she said simply. "There's always another outbreak, another virus evolving. Another pattern to recognize before it becomes a crisis." Thomas hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming since he'd watched her calm Chen. "Don't you ever get tired of carrying that responsibility?" For the first time since they'd met, Lin's professional composure fully dissolved. She leaned against the galley counter, the weight of exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. "All the time," she admitted quietly. "But then I think about my parents, about the people who didn't have someone spotting the pattern in time, and I keep going." The moment was interrupted by the captain's voice announcing their initial descent into London. Lin straightened, the vulnerable moment passing as quickly as it had appeared. But something had shifted between them. A connection formed through crisis and mutual respect. "I should check the isolation area one more time," she said. Gathering her professional demeanor again, Thomas nodded. "I'll come with you." As they moved toward the rear of the plane, the aircraft began its gradual descent. Through the windows, the hazy outline of London appeared on the horizon. After hours of confinement and uncertainty, their destination was finally in sight. Not the end of the crisis, but at least the next phase. Whatever awaited them on the ground, the strangers on Flight 823 had become something more than random travelers sharing a metal tube in the sky. They had become, however temporarily, a community bound by shared danger and the simple, powerful discovery that even in the most frightening circumstances, humanity endures. The wheels of Flight 823 touched down on London soil with a gentle bump. A collective sigh of relief whispered through the cabin, that primal reassurance of returning to Earth after hours suspended in the sky. But this was no ordinary landing, and the usual rush to unbuckle and stand was replaced by an unusual stillness. Every passenger remained seated, their masked faces turned expectantly toward the crew. Captain Wei's voice came over the intercom, his tone calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London Heathrow. As previously explained, we will be following special disembarkation procedures. Please remain in your seats until your section is called. Medical professionals are waiting to assist us." Through the windows, passengers could see they had taxied to a remote area of the airport. No jetway awaited them, but rather a fleet of vehicles, ambulances, buses with health authority markings, and several unmarked vans. People in bright yellow hazard suits moved with purpose across the tarmac. In the galley, Lynn was checking the isolation area one last time. The 7 infected passengers were in varying states. Chen had stabilized after his earlier anxiety, while 2 others had developed more serious respiratory symptoms during the descent. The oldest patient, a woman in her 70s, was receiving supplemental oxygen from the plane's emergency medical kit. "How are they?" Thomas asked, joining her as she made notes on each patient's condition. "Stable enough for transport," Lynn replied, though her furrowed brow suggested concern. The rapid drop in cabin pressure during descent sometimes exacerbates respiratory symptoms. "But the ground team is prepared." Captain Wei approached, followed by a woman in a business suit with an airport security badge. "This is Ms. Reynolds from Heathrow Emergency Operations," he explained. "She'll be coordinating with the health authorities." The woman nodded briskly. "Dr. Zhao, we've been briefed on your situation. The containment protocols you implemented mid-flight are impressive. Public Health England has authorized a full response based on your assessment." Lynn seemed to relax slightly at this. Her judgment validated, her warnings heeded without the struggle she'd faced hours earlier. "Thank you. The priority should be the infected passengers, yes," Ms. Reynolds finished for her. "We have isolation units ready for them, and a separate processing area for potentially exposed individuals. All passengers will be screened and provided with quarantine instructions." The cabin door opened and 2 medical professionals in protective gear entered. They spoke briefly with Ms. Reynolds, then approached Lynn, recognizing her authority in the situation. After a quick consultation, they began preparing the infected passengers for transfer. Thomas watched the efficient, practiced movements of the medical team. What had seemed like an overwhelming crisis at 38,000 feet was now being handled with the precision of a well-rehearsed protocol. On the ground with proper resources, what had seemed insurmountable became manageable. The disembarkation began as planned. Green zone passengers first, each receiving information packets and contact cards as they left. Yellow zone passengers followed, directed to a separate screening area. Through it all, the crew maintained their composure, guiding and reassuring. Kai, who had been the most skeptical of Lynn initially, now worked seamlessly with the medical team, anticipating needs and solving logistical problems before they arose. Priya's natural empathy helped calm anxious passengers as they exited. The air marshal, so ready to treat Lynn as a threat hours earlier, now deferred to her medical authority without question. As the last unaffected passengers disembarked, the medical team prepared to transfer the infected individuals. They brought in specialized stretchers for those who needed them, while others were able to walk with assistance. Chen gripped Lin's hand as they prepared to move him. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. for making sure I could reach my daughter. Lynn squeezed his hand gently. She'll be taken care of. I've made arrangements for someone to meet her at the hotel and explain what's happening. One by one, the infected passengers were transferred to waiting ambulances. Lynn oversaw each move, conferring with the medical team about symptoms and treatments. Thomas remained by her side, helping where he could, watching her work with growing admiration. Finally, only the crew remained on the empty aircraft. The silence felt strange after hours of tension and activity. Captain Wei gathered them in the main cabin for a final debrief before they too would be screened and processed. "I've been flying for 32 years, the captain said, looking around at his exhausted crew. "Never experienced anything like today. What you all managed to do under these circumstances." He shook his head, words failing him. Kai spoke up. "It was Dr. Zhao who made it possible. Without her, we might have landed with a plane full of infected people, spreading who knows where." All eyes turned to Lynn, who looked uncomfortable with the attention. "It was a team effort," she insisted. "And we won't know for days if we were truly successful. The incubation period means some passengers may still develop symptoms, but they'll be monitored now," Priya pointed out. "They won't be spreading it unknowingly. That's what matters." Ms. Reynolds returned to the aircraft. "Dr. Zhao, the public health director, would like to speak with you immediately, and the rest of the crew will need to proceed to screening." Lynn nodded, gathering her belongings. As the others collected their things, Thomas approached her. "So this is it?" he asked quietly. "You go with the health authorities, we go to screening, and that's the end of the story?" Something flickered across Lynn's face. Regret, perhaps, or simply exhaustion. "That's how it usually works," she replied. "I follow the path of the outbreak and everyone else returns to normal life." "Seems strange after everything we've been through together." She smiled faintly. "That's the nature of crisis. It creates intense bonds that feel like they should last forever, but then the crisis ends and everyone disperses." Thomas finished. "Still, some connections are worth maintaining, don't you think?" Before Lynn could answer, Ms. Reynolds cleared her throat impatiently. "Dr. Zhao, they're waiting." Lynn hesitated, then quickly wrote something in her notebook, tore out the page, and handed it to Thomas. "My email," she explained, "in case you ever want to compare notes on unusual passenger behaviors." It was a small gesture, but it acknowledged that what had happened between all of them, was more than just professional duty in a crisis. As Lynn followed Ms. Reynolds from the aircraft, the remaining crew gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark. They would be interviewed, tested, possibly quarantined. The procedures were still being determined. "What happens to us now?" One of the younger flight attendants asked Captain Wei. The captain considered the question. "We'll be grounded for a while, I expect." "Observation period, debriefings." "No," Kai said unexpectedly. "She means what happens to us, to who we became today." The usually reserved senior attendant looked around at his colleagues. "We can't just go back to serving drinks and demonstrating seatbelts after this, can we?" There was a moment of silence as they all absorbed the truth of his words. They had been transformed by the events of the past several hours, not just by the crisis itself, but by how they had risen to meet it. "We take it with us," Thomas suggested quietly. "Whatever we learned about ourselves, about each other, we carry that forward." 2 weeks later, Thomas sat in a cafe near his apartment, laptop open in front of him. After the landing at Heathrow, everything had happened quickly. The crew had been tested, interviewed extensively by health authorities, and placed on administrative leave during the investigation. They had been separated almost immediately upon landing, each following their own path through the medical protocols. He had learned bits and pieces since then. The outbreak had been contained. The early intervention on the flight had prevented what could have become a much larger crisis. Only 3 additional passengers had developed symptoms after landing, all from the yellow zone. Because of the swift response, contact tracing had been implemented immediately for everyone on board. Chen had recovered and been reunited with his daughter. Captain Wei had been commended by the airline for his handling of the situation. The story had made international news, though the coverage focused mostly on the public health response rather than what had actually happened on the plane. And Dr. Lin Zhao had disappeared back into the world of international disease surveillance. Her name mentioned only briefly in official reports. Thomas had waited a week before using the email address she'd given him. His message had been simple: an update on the crew, A few questions about what had happened to the passengers, and an invitation to coffee if she was ever in London again. Her reply had come 3 days later, sent from a location she didn't specify. She answered his questions about the passengers with the clinical precision he remembered, explained that the pathogen had been identified and contained, with no new cases reported in the past week. As for coffee, she wrote, "My work keeps me moving, but I'm due in London next month. Rain check?" Now, as Thomas checked his email again, a new message appeared from Lynn's address. It was brief, just flight details for her arrival the following week and a suggestion for a meeting place. He smiled to himself, thinking about how differently things might have turned out. If they had ignored her strange behavior, dismissed her as merely anxious or disruptive, if they had continued treating her as a security threat rather than listening to her warning, if any one of a dozen decisions had gone differently. His phone buzzed with a message from Priya. "Crew reunion dinner still on for Friday?" Kai's actually agreed to come. The bonds formed during those intense hours hadn't dissolved after all. The crew had stayed in touch, checking in on each other, processing what they'd experienced together. They weren't just colleagues anymore. They had become something closer to family. As he typed his reply confirming the dinner, Thomas reflected on what Lynn had said about crisis revealing who people truly are. The woman they had detained mid-air, whose words had initially seemed so threatening, had shown them not just how to handle a medical emergency, but something more valuable, how courage, expertise, and humanity could transform a potential disaster into a reminder of what people could accomplish together. Outside the cafe window, an airplane traced its path across the London sky, carrying hundreds of strangers on their own journeys. Thomas watched it disappear into the clouds and thought about all the stories unfolding above the earth at any given moment. Ordinary flights that passed without incident, and the rare extraordinary ones that changed lives forever. He closed his laptop, paid for his coffee, and stepped into the afternoon sunlight. In a week, Lynn would arrive, bringing with her memories of their shared experience and possibilities for whatever might come next. Until then, he had a crew reunion to prepare for, and stories to share about the flight that had changed everything, the day they detained a passenger whose surprising words had saved them all.